He said underwhelming, twice, about a mistake in the gravel. Now his own driver gets penalized for 1% of a percent, and Toto Wolff has said nothing at all. Hold that thought, because it's the whole story. Kimi Antonelli walked out of Hungarian Grand Prix, qualifying as championship leader, 45 points clear of Lewis Hamilton, and walked into a steward's room over a yellow flag. He left it with a 3-place grid penalty, a penalty point, and a 7th-place start in a race where overtaking at the Hungaroring is notoriously close to impossible. And the man who runs his team, the same man who publicly called an actual driving error underwhelming not long ago, hasn't said a single word about it. Here's the fact pattern stripped down. Max Verstappen spun his Red Bull at the final corner in the closing minutes of Q3. Yellow flags came out. Antonelli was mid-lap, on a push, and by his own account tried to lift for the flag. The telemetry backed him up, partially. He was 14 kilometers per hour slower entering that sector than on his previous lap, but he was 3 kilometers per hour faster passing the actual incident site because he'd braked less hard going into the corner. The stewards measured his mini-sector time at 0.03 of a second slower than his best. 0.03. Less than 1% of speed reduction, by the FIA's own accounting. If you want the stories the paddock doesn't put in the press releases, subscribe right now and tell me in the comments which country you're watching from. Because how absurd this sounds depends entirely on how closely you follow stewarding decisions where you are. Now here's the part that should stop you. The standard penalty for this kind of yellow flag breach, under the regulations, is a 5-place grid drop. The stewards reduced it to 3, in their words, because Antonelli did make a reduction in speed, even if it was, in their own phrase, insufficient and unsustained. Read that again. The panel is telling you, in the same document that punishes him, that he tried to comply. He just didn't try hard enough, by a margin so small, it barely registers on a speed trace. Was he alongside another car when this happened? No, nobody was near him. Did his actions endanger anyone? Not according to the report. Did he ignore the yellow flag entirely? No, the data shows he lifted. Did he lift enough by the letter of the rule? That's the only question that mattered, and the answer came down to a number smaller than most drivers' reaction time. That's the entire case. Not recklessness, not a near miss, a percentage point. Now let's put this next to something that happened in the exact same session, decided by the exact same panel, on the exact same Saturday. Lewis Hamilton was found to have unnecessarily impeded Oscar Piastri at turn 1, forcing the McLaren wide and ending its lap outright. That's not a marginal telemetry read, that's a car physically blocked from completing a competitive lap. Hamilton got a 3-place penalty. Antonelli, whose entire offense amounts to a 0.03 of a second discrepancy in a mini-sector, got the same 3-place penalty. Neither ruling on its own is indefensible. The guidelines exist, the panel applied them, and both cases followed the letter of Article 2.55 on yellow flag compliance. But set them side by side and ask yourself honestly whether ending another driver's lap outright and being 0.03 of a second short on a throttle lift belong in the same punishment bracket. Nobody at the FIA is going to tell you they don't. And here's where Wolff's silence starts to look less like restraint and more like a pattern. This is not the first time the head of Mercedes has had strong public words about Antonelli. Back in Monza, after a spin into the gravel ended the Italian's afternoon early, Wolff stood in front of reporters and didn't soften anything. Underwhelming, he said. Underwhelming twice in the same short answer. You can't put the car in the gravel bed, he said, and expect to be in the race. That is not a team boss protecting his driver from criticism. That is a team boss delivering it himself, unprompted, to the press. So follow the chain. When Antonelli makes an actual unambiguous mistake, the man who runs his team goes on record and calls it out by name. When the sport's own governing body drops the championship leader 3 places over a percentage point smaller than most rounding errors, that same man says nothing. Not a quote, not a statement. Nothing that surfaced anywhere Mercedes' name normally shows up. And if you're not subscribed yet, this is the exact kind of story you'll want to be here for when it happens again. Because governing bodies that get away with marginal calls tend not to stop making them. Let's do the math on what 3 places actually cost here, because 3 places always sounds smaller than it is. The Hungaroring has been called Monaco, without the walls for a reason, narrow, technical, and short on overtaking chances. Recent history shows barely more than 4 in 10 Hungarian Grands Prix get one from pole, but climb outside the top 3 on the grid, and your win probability collapses fast on this layout. Dropping from 4th to 7th doesn't just cost Antonelli grid slots. It puts him behind Max Verstappen, behind George Russell, behind cars he was faster than all weekend, on the one circuit where passing them back is the hardest task on the calendar. That's not a rounding error translated into positions. That's a real shot at extending a 45-point championship lead. Traded for 0.03 of a second, the driver couldn't have physically perceived in the cockpit. Antonelli himself, speaking to Sky Sports before the penalty was even confirmed, walked through his own lap with total transparency. He explained losing time to a tailwind, gaining time in the previous lap's final corner, and said plainly that the yellow flag came while he was already entering the corner, and that he tried his best to lift. He wasn't hiding from the moment. He laid out exactly what happened, sector by sector, before anyone forced him to. That's a defensible account, and I'll say plainly that the steward's own report backs most of it up. He did lift, the telemetry proves it. It's also not an account that changes the fact that a 19-year-old driver, alone in a car at over 200 kilometers per hour, was expected to calibrate his braking to a threshold that shows up only in post-session data analysis, not in anything visible from the cockpit in real time. Would this penalty exist if the margin had been 1/10 of a second instead of 0.03? Almost certainly not, based on every other precedent the stewards themselves have cited in similar rulings. Is that proven with certainty from the outside? No, and I'm not going to pretend it is. It's simply a question anyone reading that steward's report is entitled to ask, especially when the same panel handed down an identical penalty for a driver who ended a rival's lap completely. What comes next is the part nobody at Mercedes wanted written down this weekend. Before I give it to you, subscribe, because the pattern here doesn't stop with this race weekend, and you'll want to already have this file open when it surfaces again. Here's the structural piece, because this isn't really about one championship leader losing 3 grid spots. It's about a stewarding standard so granular that mini-sector telemetry down to 100ths of a second now decides grid position applied inconsistently against violations of wildly different severity in the same session by the same panel. That's not a Mercedes problem. That's a sport-wide problem, and it lands hardest on whoever's leading the championship when the margin call goes against them. We've talked before on this channel about pit walls and panels getting sequencing wrong under pressure. It's the same shape of story we covered with Ferrari's radio admission after the same qualifying session. Different team, different mechanism, same underlying truth. The people with the power to explain a decision in real time often choose silence instead, and the silence tells you almost as much as a statement would. Do I know for certain Wolff is choosing not to comment because he thinks the penalty is unfair? Or because he simply doesn't want to pick a fight with the FIA this close to the summer break? No, and that's exactly the problem. If even the people closest to this decision won't put a number on how unfair it was, then the standard being applied isn't a standard the paddock can actually rely on. Here's the verdict. Kimi Antonelli lost 3 grid places at the Hungaroring, over 1% of speed reduction, ruled by the same panel that handed an identical penalty to a driver who physically forced a rival off the racing line. Toto Wolff, a man with no history of staying quiet when his driver does something wrong, has said nothing at all when the wrong might belong to someone else. That's not consistency, that's selective silence. So tell me, is this the FIA holding a hard line on safety, or a stewarding standard so fine it can't tell a real mistake from a rounding error? Drop your verdict and hit like if you already know which one it is. The championship goes into the summer break with this margin sitting on the record, unresolved and uncommented on. When the paddock reconvenes and the panel is asked to explain the gap between these two rulings, you'll want to already know exactly what happened here. This story is not over, and hit subscribe now, because the next domino in this pattern is coming. Until the next one.